All right. Hello and welcome to another QMS Bootcamp brought to you by Texas Quality Assurance. I am Kyle Chambers, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that, oh my gosh, there's no lack of confusion, differing opinions and ideas on, and we're really going to help make the complication of what's an NCR, what's a CAR, what's a SCAR, what's a PAR, all these different terms. How does it integrate with risk? Is risk-based thinking really something new? What does the standard say, and what on earth ought we to do about it? Fact is, this is nowhere nearly as complicated as we often think it is. But as we all know, sometimes the simplest ideas are the hardest ones to break down and understand. So the first thing we're going to do here is we are actually going to dive into the standard. So let me get to my screen up here. So we're going to be looking at the ISO 9001 2015 edition of the standard. This is the most recent, most up-to-date version of the standard. But we're also going to take a look at the older ISO 9001 2008. Now, granted, nothing in the 2008 one standard is auditable, but they didn't reinvent the wheel with 2015. It was meant to be an update to an existing, mostly functional version of the standard. So we're going to take a look at kind of what 2008's idea was and what they attempted to do with 2015 and really help understand these processes better. So first, we're diving into the 2008 edition. Let's go look at where we came from before we look at where we are today. So 2000 edition of the ISO 9001, 2008 edition of the ISO 9001 standard, we're going to be looking here predominantly in the measurement, analysis, and improvement clause. Now, for anyone familiar with the PDCA cycle, plan, do, check, act, pretty straightforward. We've got some other videos on it, so I won't go into too much detail here. But you plan the process, you execute the process, you check if you executed it according to the plan, and then you take an action to either move forward as is, because, hey, we did a great job. We're going to get a concession. We're going to go back and make a change to our system, or we're going to make a change to our system because we think we could do better. So let's take a look here at Clause 8, Measurement, Analysis, and Improvement. It talks about customer satisfaction, internal audits. It's not what we're looking for here. What we're looking for here starts in Clause 8. Now, Clause 8.3. Now, they made a shift in the new version of the standard, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but they kind of reshuffled where these things fit in regard to the PDCA cycle. And in shifting where they fit in the PDCA cycle, that's really what looks like generated a lot of the language and terminology changes that we're dealing with. So 8.3, control of non-conforming product. Okay, so the organization shall ensure that product that doesn't conform meets requirements and is controlled to prevent unintended use or delivery. Makes total sense. If it's not working right, if it's non-conforming, don't let it get sent to the customer. Pretty straightforward. This is a non-conforming instance. Non-conforming product. Detected non-conformity is the term they use here. So when applicable, where applicable, the organization shall deal with the non-conforming product. I sound like I'm talking to one of my kids. You got to deal with what happened, deal with the consequences of it. Where applicable, the organization shall deal with the non-conforming product by one or more of the following ways. Eliminate action or take action to eliminate the detected non-conformity. We're talking about an isolated incident or a series of isolated incidents by authorizing its use, release, or acceptance under concession. Is applicable by the customer. That makes sense. Maybe it was cut too long or cut too short. It's not according to the requirement, but this is expensive material. We want to call the customer and get authorization. Will it still work? It's not ideal, but hey, we get the authorization. We move forward. Life's good. We're still able to hit their date. Life's good. Taking action to preclude its original intended use. We call that scrap, right? Or taking action appropriate to the potential effects or nonconformity when nonconforming product is detected after the delivery or use has started. And this happens sometimes. It gets to the customer. It's like, well, let's just do the best we can to mitigate and contain the situation. But, we're not looking here to make a change to the system. We're just fixing this issue. We're not updating procedures. We're not updating forms. This is where we talk about a nonconformance report. NCR. Something went wrong, we fixed it, we moved on. Something went wrong, we got concessions, we moved on. We scrapped it, we move on. Still record the data. Fantastic data points. I cannot overemphasize how useful these data points are, but we're just dealing with isolated incidents here. Okay. So they do a good job of detailing this in mostly common English. The 2015 edition of the standard, we'll see that it's written in lawyerese. It's not normal English, it's lawyerese. All right, so we move on down to the continual improvement clause. So they purposely put corrective actions in our improvement clause, and they put control of nonconforming product, or NCRs, in our normal monitoring of the management system, which I completely agree is where nonconforming product ought to lie. Completely agree corrective actions ought to align the improvement clause as well. The question we have is preventative actions. Where do they fall? Do they fall in the improvement category? I'm trying to get the zoom right here. This is sometimes a little fun. We'll zoom out a little bit there. So do they fall in the planning category under the P, or do they fall under the A for an action in our PDCA cycle? This turns out is a really, really crucial, critical question. Well, let's take a look. Corrective action versus preventative action. Corrective action is the organization shall take action to eliminate the causes of nonconformities to prevent reoccurrence. Okay, preventative action. The organization shall determine action to eliminate causes of potential nonconformities to prevent their occurrence. So the difference here, detected nonconformity, potential nonconformity. Hey, we're tracking so far. They're pretty much the same process. So we have to review nonconformities. Well, we have no nonconformities down here, but we can review potential nonconformities. Determine the cause of the nonconformity, determine potential nonconformity causes. Evaluate the need for action to ensure that nonconformities do not recur, corrective action. Determine and implement actions needed for preventative action. So far, we're tracking that these are pretty much the same process. Record the results taken, record the results taken. Review effectiveness, so critical for corrective and preventative actions. You have to review the effectiveness. Obviously, if we scrap a component, we know we scrapped it. What's to review? We scrapped it. We don't care about effectiveness. We're just trying to get the product out the door, and we want to record there was a problem. We want to record we lost some product. We want to keep track of the cost. We want to keep track of how many times this happens, but we're just dealing with it one-on-one in a non-conformance report. In corrective and preventative actions, we're putting changes in place. Dadgum, I need to make sure these are good changes. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes you put big changes into play and it doesn't work out, and you have the same problem, if not new problems resolving. So that review of effectiveness is so incredibly important. And this does mean that for our corrective and preventative actions, we're going to have basically 3 stages on it. So we're going to have open, we're going to have complete, pending verification of effectiveness, and closed, effectiveness verified. Whereas on our non-conformance reports, we're kind of open and closed. That's it. There's nowhere in between, open or closed. But again, our corrective and preventative actions, we got that 3 stage there. We're open, we're complete, pending verification of effectiveness. It may sit here for a while, truthfully, or we're closed, effectiveness verified. But those are from the more common English version, the 2008 edition of the standard. Makes a lot of sense. The only thing that's a little questionable is they put preventative action in the continual improvement part of the PDCA cycle, which would mean that we're not dealing with preventative actions until after the fact. And what they wanted to do with 2015, in addition to just making it longer and more complicated for their own reasons, which check out any podcast we've done with Chris Paris, fantastic way to take a look at that. But the 2015 edition of the standard, big piece that they did is they took out the preventative action clause. You'll see here that we don't have a preventative action clause. And what they did is they incorporated that into the planning of our management system. And they actually explain it in the standard. I'm quite often dumbfounded that these are such complicated issues because they come right out and tell you what they're doing. So we're not going to read all of the appendix 8.4, but I am going to read some of it here. Risk-based thinking applied in this international standard has enabled some reduction in prescriptive requirements, the greater flexibility than 2001, 2008. Totally agree, more flexibility. and requirements for processes, documented information, and such. Okay. They say just above it, though, that one of the key purposes of a quality management system is in and of itself to act as a preventative tool. Consequently, this international standard does not have a separate clause or subclause on preventative actions. So what they're saying here is that the entire management system, which is a big part of the P of the planning in PDCA, we need to think about preventative measures. Okay. Let me spell out a little bit more detailed here. Although 6.1, this is the risk clause in the standard, specifies that the organization shall take actions to address risk. There's no requirement for formal methods, risk management, or documented process, which I think most folks don't realize. It doesn't actually require you to do anything, document anything in regard to risk. Now, sometimes it's hard to prove things without documentation, but the organization can decide whether or not to develop a more complex risk management methodology. Okay, so what this typically means is that we have an upfront risk register that we want to update on an annual basis, and we're going to identify either a risk with so low of consequence or likelihood that we're there, but it's so low, it's just not really worth my effort to fix. On the other hand, risks that we do take action to mitigate, well, we're going to come to a friendly tool called a corrective action or a preventative action to show what we did about it. The idea being that if we're doing it purely on an opportunity, it's preventative. If we're doing it on a known risk or a known nonconformity, it's probably going to be corrective. Either way, it's the same form, the same process. So now let's take a look in the 2015 edition of the standard where they define the requirements for our nonconformance reports, where they define the requirements for our corrective and preventative action reports. Fortunately, the language here isn't so clear as it was in 2008, but we're going to get through it. So, control of nonconforming outputs. The organization shall ensure the outputs that do not conform are identified and controlled to prevent unintended use or delivery. Pretty much the same language we had in 2008. And what you're going to do is you're going to deal with the consequences of correction, segregation, say like a quarantine area, inform the customer, obtain authorization. We're tracking pretty well with the 2008 edition of the standard. And they give you a little more detail about documentation to retain, the type of nonconformity, what you did about it immediately, any concessions obtained, and who had authority to do it. That's sometimes a big deal. So pretty straightforward for this. This defines our nonconformance report. Now, one thing I do like is they no longer call it control of nonconforming product. They call it control of nonconforming output. Any process has an output. Your purchasing process has a purchase order and materials. All right. So issue a nonconformance report for purchasing. Folks working in accounting, Lord knows you get all sorts of weird purchase order requests from your team. Well, every time you start running into weird purchase order requests that aren't completed properly, issue them a nonconformance report. Track that data. Track the data, track the data, track the data. You can make good decisions once we have enough data. Your nonconformance report, fantastic, fantastic tool. I totally agree that the control of nonconforming product was put in our measurement, analysis, and improvement clause in 2008. So here they put it under our, scroll up here. Yeah, production and service provision. Okay, it's kind of there, but it's really a good monitoring and measuring tool. Really fantastic monitoring and measuring tool. So now let's scroll down to an improvement clause. The idea being that improvement comes at the end of the PDCA cycle. Here they talk about nonconformity and corrective action. Now, I really dislike that the word nonconformity is put in this clause because it implies that this is our nonconformance report clause, but it's not. The reason that nonconformity is put with corrective action in this clause title is because a corrective action is issued because of a nonconformity, either a single nonconformity or a trend in nonconformities that we see that this happens so many times a month. No way we can gather that data unless we're tracking our NCRs for isolated instances. So pretty much same requirements here. It's written more verbose, but hey, we know that's the deal with the 2015 edition of the standard. It's a lot more verbose. But when a nonconformity occurs, including from customer complaints, the organization shall react to the nonconformity, to take action, control it, deal with the consequences. This is absolutely section letter 10.2, letter A, is a recitation of what we looked at up here for our control of non-conforming outputs. This is effectively identify it in this first paragraph and deal with it. So yes, our corrective action does in of itself encapsulate the requirements of a non-conformance report, but that's just one piece of the process. Then we need to evaluate action to eliminate the cause of the nonconformity. This is why we have a root cause analysis as a part of our corrective action and not as a part of our nonconformance report. When material is received damaged, I don't need to do a root cause analysis on it. I need to inform my supplier that it was damaged, and I need to keep track of how many times my supplier provides me damaged product. Okay, very different than if I came back and said, you know what, supplier, over the last 6 months, 20% of your shipments to us have come in damaged. We need you to fix the problem, and we're going to potentially discontinue using you or, request some other concession from you if you don't fix it. Well, there's a corrective action. Now we're going to require them to identify why they mess up with us, supplier corrective action. But that's very different than the isolated incident, which is tracked with a nonconformance report, a huge piece of our monitoring and measuring process. Corrective action process is part of our improvement process. We cannot make good improvement without good data and trends. Okay, so we'll continue. Corrective action, identify the root cause, figure out how to eliminate the root cause, and look and see if other similar things are occurring. Very, very big one. Determine if similar nonconformities exist or could potentially occur. Then we need to implement any action needed. This is the corrective action phase of our corrective action. Review the effectiveness of the corrective action, which we talked about. It's got a 3-stage in there. So here is stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Then we want to update risk and opportunities during planning if necessary. This is why I always suggest before we go to a management review, we take a look at all of our corrective preventative actions from the last year, and we update our risk register appropriately, because obviously these are risks that we determined were meriting mitigation. Make changes to the quality management system. That's a big piece of a corrective action. If you're doing a corrective action, you're making a change. You don't issue a corrective action unless you're changing something. So what are we changing? Maybe we're changing a few lines in a procedure. Maybe we're creating a new document or revising a document because it didn't account for things we needed to catch. Maybe when we create a corrective action, we determine that we need to change the layout of our facility to ensure that we've got a better staging area over here for the product because we're getting a backlog or something of those natures. But that's what a corrective action is for. It is the evidence of the change we made. Why do we make it? Nonconformities or potential nonconformities. Okay. Now, all of this ties in with risk, which comes up in clause 6 here. So they tell us to take actions to address risk and opportunities. All right. So we want to give that it can achieve intended results. Well, isn't that the same thing as corrective action? We want to make sure that the action achieved its intended results. Well, they're putting those preventative measures up front in the P of the PDCA. So it's really the change that happened is we shifted where we account for preventative actions. But unfortunately, that caused a lot of changes in the language to the standard that can result in a lot of confusion. So we really just have a couple of main points here. And I'm going to pull up our TQA Cloud QMS software here. It's just a demo site, nothing but fictitious data on it. I swear, not a cheesy sales pitch. It's just a good way to talk about these things. Of course, we'll never be offended or upset if someone wants to use our software. But let's take a look at our nonconformance report section of our software here, okay? So give it a second here. Sometimes these live streams tax the video on here, and things tend to lag a little bit. But let's open up one of these. They always say that the plumber's the one that has the leaky pipes and so forth. Well, I'm a computer geek, and go figure, I've got an outdated computer. But let's open up our nonconformance report right here. And you'll see that this is really pretty simple. We're just looking at individual isolated events. Here, let me go ahead and get something start it over here for corrective actions. All right, so let's go ahead and edit this item. All right, it's giving me an alert here saying that this one's already closed. So I'll just go ahead and do a new one here. Sorry, a little safety measure we put in place just to make sure we don't use edit things that are in the closed status. All right, so what we've got here is we're going to identify the responsible party. This comes directly from a requirement from the standard. We'll take a look here in 8.7. Again, 8.7 being the nonconformance report clause of our standard. Let me scroll down here. Sorry. I always hate when people scroll like this on the screen, so my apologies. But it says the organization shall retain documented information that identifies the authority deciding the action in respect to the nonconformity. So we have a responsible party field here, and we identify the disposition. Who does the disposition? Who decides what happens? But it's pretty straightforward. What job number? Is this internal, external issue? What work area? Basic details that we're looking at here. Then we go into the disposition. Who's doing it? Are we scrapping it? Are we reworking it? What are we doing here? But it's an individual incident. One time. We don't care about anything else beyond the one time of the incident. Now, let's take a look at our corrective actions. See, corrective actions, they don't care just about the one-time incident. You can have a corrective action from a one-time incident. And a great example of that might be, say, a customer complaint. Maybe you've got a customer complaint. Maybe you've got a finding from an audit. Those are one-time incidents. But you for certain want to make sure your auditor doesn't find it again in the future. So we want to prevent reoccurrence. You want to make sure your customer doesn't have the same complaint again. Prevent reoccurrence. And that inevitably means if you're going to prevent a reoccurrence, clearly your system as status quo failed. That's fine. It failed. Status quo failed. We need to improve something in the system. Corrective action. So same basic stuff. What's the project? Who issued it? Who's the responsible party? Same basic requirements. We've got a nonconformance tab here. Is what was the nonconformance or potential nonconformance for preventative action? What'd you do immediately to contain it? Again, this comes from the language of the standard. So let's come down to 10.2, our corrective action clause. Scroll too far there. Is deal with the consequences, take action to control or correct it. That's what we're doing here. What's nonconformity? How do we control or correct it? A little bit about containment, maybe instruction, leave as is, quarantine, rework. But what'd you do immediately? Education, instruction. We told them don't do it no more, but we don't have anything better we can do yet because we didn't have a work instruction or nothing for it. Okay, I guess that works. That's immediately dealing with it. But then we got to figure out why we have to deal with it in the first place. Do your root cause analysis. Do your corrective action. What'd you do to make sure it doesn't happen again? Then identify some appropriate amount of time and reevaluate if your fix even worked in the first place. Generally it does because we're pretty smart, educated folks. We understand our business. But sometimes I got to tell you, I'm guilty of it as well. We put a fix in place just to go, wow, we really kind of complicated things there. That didn't help very much. That just made more work and made more things difficult. We still got the same problem plus a new one. This is where evaluation of effectiveness is critical. Now, some people argue, well, can't we just use one form for everything? And you can, but it's not smart at all. I mean, the standard won't tell you don't do it. But if you want to run an effective management system, don't do it. Because you do not want people confusing in their head individual instances of data collection, nonconformance reporting, with fixing and improving the management system, corrective actions. They're very different processes that ought not be construed together, except in those instances where we know we're going to make a change. Now, one thing that I like to suggest to folks is a book anyone running a business or management system ought to read. Well, read the first half of the book. We get pretty geeky in the second half of the book. Lots of math, stuff people don't care about. But the first half by Edward Deming is Out of the Crisis. In it, one of the terms he discusses is something that we call tampering. The idea of tampering is when we issue a corrective action for everything. We do not want to tamper with our management system. If we're going to make a change to a procedure or form, we had dadgum better well have some good reasons to do it. Not just, well, I think we need a corrective action for this. No, prove it. Why do you need a corrective action? Why do you need to change something? Was the system failing? Or was this person just poorly trained? Because if that's the case, we may want a corrective action on our training system. We may not necessarily want a corrective action on something in our production system. So really evaluate, was the issue that we failed to train people? That's a whole different root cause than this issue that we're looking at right now. So just some things to consider, but inevitably it means that we have nonconformance reports, corrective preventative action reports, and bear in mind that risk is our preventative action system, documented upfront and as we go. So it's not all that complicated or confusing. It just takes some time to go through the standard and understand what they're trying to do and how we can incorporate that in our business. So that's it for nonconformance, corrective actions, preventative actions. The only real piece remaining is going to be taking a look at what we call our engineering change controls, ECNs. So depending on the size and complexity of your business, I typically argue that our corrective action system is sufficient. However, for engineering change notifications, when utilized in conjunction with a design and development process, that ECN can be preventative in nature and is there purely to improve our design as an input to a new process in the design. On the other hand, if we are making changes because of known nonconformities, because of customer complaints, we have to have a corrective action. So for those reasons, since corrective action can be used for correction and prevention, I most of the time very strongly argue not to include an ECN for our small businesses. Again, for teams that are very highly involved in design and development, an ECN can be a fantastic process to track those changes in documentation. But bear in mind, if you're doing this because of a known nonconformity, we must also have that corrective action paired with it to identify the root cause and evaluate the effectiveness of the individual change. So what will often happen is you might have one corrective action that is related to potentially 4 or 5 or more ECNs because you're tracking all of the various changes to documentation you're doing. So let's make sure that the ECN process is not something that the standard actually calls out. And an ECN process, apart from a corrective action process, can actually leave you vulnerable to findings and can leave you vulnerable to tampering with your management system. But we'll go into more detail in another video on the use of ECNs. But that should be it. So I really hope this clears up some of the confusion, and I hope to hear from you soon.